we don't know exactly what capability that is currently being worked on. We haven't seen this sort of confirmed officially. But there is a fear that this might be a nuclear weapon that could be placed into space that would sort of sit in space until it is detonated, which would then cause a nuclear explosion in space.
Okay, and with that nuclear explosion, just in terms of the implications, how would it work in terms of for the satellites around in that area, in the vicinity, but also even further away in space?
So there's two physical implications that we'd be worried about straight away. Number one is the electromagnetic pulse that would essentially fry the electronics on board of the satellites in the surrounding area, depending on the size of the nuclear warhead used. But then also the environment of radiation that weapon would leave behind. And that could take a very long time to actually sort of go away fully to clear. And in the meantime, that would mean that the satellites in the area would degrade much faster. So it's the electronics on board of the satellite that would be affected immediately. So it depends, for example, if a satellite is hardened in the sense that it is hardened against electromagnetic pulses, it may not be affected. However, it would be the electronics on board that would be affected, which could potentially mean that the satellite can't be maneuvered anymore or cannot fulfill its primary purpose, whichever one that may be, whether it was used for Earth observation, whether it was used as a communication satellite, depending on the initial purpose.
Going on from that, just what would it mean if Putin launches this and detonates it? What would that actually mean for people back on Earth? Can we just talk about commercial satellites for now, just first off? What would it mean if they're destroyed?
Yeah, absolutely. So it depends, obviously, which satellites are in the surrounding area of that detonation taking place. Most commercial satellites are unlikely to be radiation or electromagnetic pulse hardened, so they would be affected. And depending on the purpose of these satellites, we may be left without, certain services that provide internet or communications or satellite images. We are hugely reliant on space already, perhaps in ways that we don't always realize in our day-to-day lives because it's just become part and parcel of how we operate and how our daily lives work. But a lot is dependent on satellites. Emergency services are one of these. Again, it depends whether the satellites sort of responsible for these services are near the explosion at the time of it happening. Also, if there's potential alternative satellites that can be used if sort of this first instance of this fails.
You talk about the impact as if a government satellite, and group of them were destroyed, if they're being used for the military, for example, what would their implications?
That's an interesting question. So, for example, most US military satellites will be EMP, so electromagnetic pulse hardened, and also radiation hardened. So there's a chance that they won't be affected. But there's obviously other satellites used by states that could be affected by this. And this is very much a red line that we haven't seen crossed. So we have seen kinetic sort of tests against satellites in space, but never ever has a state attacked another state's satellite. So that would be a new red line that hasn't been crossed so far.
So what would those kind of military satellites being used for? Do you know anything about that in terms of?
So satellites for military purposes are used for the majority of sort of how the military these days operates. So there's sort of 3 or 4 main sort of areas. Number one is PNT, so positioning, navigation and timing. Obviously GPS is the most famous one of those, but there's several other versions as well. Then communications, satellite communications. Lastly, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance. So that is the sort of military version of Earth observation satellites, but also radar, for example. But there's also missile early warning and tracking satellites as well.
As you said, it depends on how large the nuclear warhead is. But if it's, there have been previous examples, how many satellites could it destroy?
So as you said, it very much depends on how big the warhead is. It also depends on which orbit it is detonated in. To give us sort of an idea of what that might look like, we have seen a high-altitude nuclear detonation test back in 1962, which was called Starfish Prime, and that was when the US detonated a warhead at 400 kilometers in altitude. And what we saw then actually is the low Earth orbit at the time was a lot less populated than it is now, but even then it knocked out a third of all satellites in that orbit, just to give us an idea. But it also affected the electrical grid in Hawaii, which was 1,450 kilometers away. So really sort of vast and long-lasting effects. So if we're looking at sort of where the space powers currently sit, obviously it was the US and Russia at the time of the Soviet Union that were the sort of preeminent space powers. that is really no longer the case. If we're looking at space powers, Russia is still there, but it's definitely declining. So the US would have the most to lose, perhaps in terms of how many satellites they have and to what extent they're dependent on satellites. But also China, which is obviously an up-and-coming space power, but who have invested a lot in its space program over the last couple of decades. So one might say that Russia has the least to lose in that aspect, but I think it would be wrong to assume that Russia would not sacrifice its own way of life because it is a space user. And obviously it is also sacrificing the space program that it has built, obviously, ever since the first satellite Sputnik was launched in 1957.
And can I just... So obviously this is all in development. Why do you think that Putin would be doing, in terms of what message does this send to other states like China and the US? What kind of message does this send? Is it that, we are as good as you guys? Is it kind of, with nuclear weapons, it's all about mutually destruction, all that. Is it that, why would he be doing this?
I wouldn't want to speculate on the sort of reasons or the motivations, but just if we're looking at nuclear detonations in space, if we're trying to sort of frame it in the context of counter-space weapons, nuclear weapons in space are really at the very far end of those sort of options because they are indiscriminate, so you cannot target a specific satellite with this, and you would also sacrifice your own satellites and your own space capabilities in that moment. Even by placing this weapon into space, if it is indeed a nuclear weapon in space, then that would violate the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which is basically the basis of sort of space treaties and space laws. Some people criticize it for being sort of too basic or too old and just too outdated to really ring true. But I would actually argue that it's the principles and the sort of basic, consensus that was built around it that make it such a strong treaty. And this treaty prohibits the placement of weapons of mass destruction in space, which obviously a nuclear weapon would fall under. So that's just the placement rather than the actual use of such a weapon. If that weapon was used, it would violate the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which was actually sort of signed just after both the Soviet Union and the US carried out a number of nuclear tests in space, sort of a lessons learned type treaty. And then depending on what the detonation actually affects, it might also potentially violate the New START Treaty because that prohibits any sort of attack or any sort of impact that is had on nuclear or generally missile early warning satellites.
What would be the knock-on effect of if Putin did this in terms of the treaty and everything? How would the world respond?
So this would definitely be a red line to be crossed and crossed almost multiple times over, in the sense that we haven't even seen a sort of kinetic attack against another state satellite, let alone a nuclear detonation that sort of wipes out multiple satellites in one go. I think we would see a Russia that is even more isolated than it is now. Obviously, Russia has already been isolated as a result of its invasion of Ukraine, and there have been several sanctions put in place that also specifically target Russia's aerospace sector. But I think Russia would also isolate itself from the few allies it has left. I think notably China, who again have invested massively in their space program and who would lose a lot from the placement or even the detonation of such a weapon. We have this turn of phrase that's the nuclear option is the last available option. This is very much what I would see the sort of detonation of such a weapon. Because it is, at this point, if you are using such a weapon, that means that the sort of maintenance and keeping of allies no longer matters to the Kremlin at that point.